As beginner programmers, we're often told on what languages we should be learning. You might hear JavaScript from someone, you might hear Python from another, or some people might just tell you to jump straight into C++. So in this video, I'm going to describe what Python's good for, what it isn't good for, and if we should be still pursuing it in 2024. So first, let's describe what Python is. Python is a dynamically typed, high-level language. What dynamically typed means is that you don't have to state anything like the variables, you're not going to have to describe certain things, you're not going to have to point the memory anywhere like you have to do in other very low level languages like Rust or C++. It's also a compiled language, and what compiled means is that when you're running your code, it goes through it line by line by line, which makes it a very slow language compared to C++, which can be up to like 1,000 times faster. But this speed is often very overrated, especially when the demographic of Python users are either beginners or speed is not really an element, which is going to help me get to what Python's strengths are and what they're highly used for. So if you're getting into Python, I think if you're a beginner, it's a near perfect choice, especially if it's your first ever programming language and you have no experience with programming whatsoever. Python reads almost exactly like English, and it's really easy to get into for new programmers. But another thing Python is really good for is back-end development. Now, if you're new to programming, what back-end development is it's basically the server side of websites and web apps that you might see online. For example, Netflix and Reddit, they both had, when they were starting out, a back-end in this web framework that I teach on the channel named Flask. Another really good thing that Python is good for is machine learning and AI. Right now, Python is the go-to choice for all AI and machine learning tasks. All these chatbots you see like ChatGPT, they're all using Python. And now the last thing I'll state for Python is that it's a very good hobby language. So small projects that you're going to be doing that you don't really want to go too heavy into, or you want to do like a quick script to manage some files or anything, Python will be the ideal programming language for you if you're comfortable with it. Now, what are Python's negatives? Now, I can go on all day about Python's negatives, but I'll keep it short. What Python's negatives are mainly is when you get into high tier development. So like I said, Netflix and Reddit both used Flask and Python at one point, but they have gotten insanely huge in these recent years, and there's no way that Python would be able to handle that type of load that they are currently handling with all this user management and data and all these channels that they have to run through on their backend. There's no way that Python will be capable of doing it on that big of a scale. So that is one of their biggest weaknesses, is scaling with Python. Another big issue with Python, or I guess not issue, but another route that if you wanted to pursue you wouldn't bring Python with you, is front-end development. Front-end development is not really something Python's really good for, especially when you compare it to languages like JavaScript or literally anything else. They do have certain libraries like Kivy, which can be used for Python front-end, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. And I tend to think with Python developers is that they get too comfortable with all of these libraries that are developed for them, and they never get to try out anything new. Like if I had the idea to stick with Kivy, I would have never pursued JavaScript and learned the React framework, and I wouldn't know how to build other things with JavaScript, like with Node or anything, which would make me very hard to market myself to companies if you're trying to get hired. Now, another field I wouldn't recommend Python is game development. Now, there is a library for Python called, I believe it's called Pygame, and I do have some experience with it, and while it's good for these small games like Space Invaders and all these other old arcade games, it's very hard to scale, and if you are trying to be a game developer, I guarantee that your dream game that you have in mind will be very hard to run with Python. So I would never recommend, if you want to get into full-time game development, to go with Python. Now let's say that after all of this you decide that you still want to go with Python, which I do believe is a good choice for beginners. It gets you building stuff really quickly, which I think is the most important way to learn how to program. If you're not building, you're not learning. So I think Python is great at speeding up the learning process and getting you building and getting a passion built for you as quick as possible. And then once you have a foundation in programming with Python, then I think you can start experimenting and going to stuff like JavaScript and maybe programming language like Go in the future to strengthen your skills. Now, if you decide that you do want to go with Python, I do have some recommendations. So here is the book I recommend to learn how to program with Python. This is the book that got me started. I'd say it took me about 1 to 2 months of 4 hours a week, maybe more on some occasions, maybe less on some occasions. This book will get you started from typing hello world to making web apps with frameworks like Django to making games with Pygame. So this will really get you set Python fundamentals and get you building as soon as possible. Now let's say you don't want to get a book, you prefer getting taught by a teacher. There is a really good Udemy course that you can get for free with a free trial by Angela Yu. I believe it's called 100 Days of Python. I looked through it a little bit after I finished this book. I didn't have a need for it after I finished the book, but if you're gonna pick between the two, I think it's a really good choice. Alright guys, well if you enjoyed this video, please remember to subscribe and like, and join me for the next one. I'll see you guys.